12,000 people died. That is the figure epidemiologists arrived at decades later when they went back through the records. The government's first official explanation was influenza. London, December 1952. A coal fog settled over the city from the 5th to the 9th and did not lift. Within weeks, the death registers were full. But the Ministry of Health had already chosen its story, and it would hold that story for months, while the real numbers sat in locked filing cabinets. The question this video answers is not what killed those people. That was never in doubt. The question is who knew, when they knew it, and what they decided to do with that knowledge. Welcome to the Grim Archive. Tonight's file, the Great Smog of London. To understand the cover-up, you first have to understand what coal meant to Britain in 1952. The country was still rebuilding from the war. Coal was not simply a fuel, it was the engine of national recovery. It heated homes, powered factories, and ran the electricity grid that the Attlee government had nationalized just 5 years earlier. The new Conservative government under Churchill inherited those power stations. They also inherited a population that burned tens of millions of tons of domestic coal every year. Coal was not a policy choice, it was the economy itself. The fog began on the evening of Friday, December 5th. A temperature inversion, cold air trapped beneath a warmer layer above, held the city's pollution flat against the ground. London had known fog before. The city had lived with it for a century. But this was different. Sulfur dioxide from millions of coal fires mixed with the damp air and converted into sulfuric acid particles. The fog turned yellow, then greenish. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Buses stopped running. A performance at Sadler's Wells Theatre was abandoned mid-act because the audience could no longer see the stage. Most people simply went inside and waited. The smog did not lift until December 9th, 5 days in which the city could not breathe. The smog lifted on December 9th, 5 days. By any immediate measure, it seemed to have passed. Londoners cleaned the yellow residue from their windowsills and went back to work. But inside the London County Council's public health offices, the weekly death figures were already telling a different story. In the week ending December 13th, recorded deaths in the London Administrative County reached 4,703, more than twice the seasonal average. Undertakers ran out of coffins, florists ran out of flowers. The mortuaries were overwhelmed. The numbers were not subtle. The Ministry of Health received those figures. This is documented. Internal memos from December 1952, declassified decades later under public records legislation, show that senior civil servants were briefed on the excess death toll within days of the smog lifting. The numbers were not ambiguous. They were not preliminary. They showed a catastrophic spike directly coinciding with the pollution event. And yet the ministry's first public statement, issued in the weeks that followed, attributed the excess mortality to a severe influenza outbreak. There was a flu season that winter. It was real. But the ministry's own internal data showed it could not account for the scale of what they were seeing. The influenza explanation was not a mistake. That is the important thing to hold on to. Researchers Michelle Bell and Deborah Davis, writing in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives in 2004, re-examined the original mortality data and found that the excess deaths aligned with sulfur dioxide exposure, not with influenza case rates. The ministry's own internal correspondence from December and January shows officials were aware that flu could not explain the geographic concentration of deaths, which mapped almost exactly onto the densest pollution zones. They knew. The flu story was selected because it was available, it was familiar, and most critically, it required nothing. In Parliament, the pressure was building. Independent scientists and a handful of MPs were asking questions the ministry was not prepared to answer honestly. Norman Dodds, the Labour MP for Dartford, raised the smog deaths repeatedly in the Commons through early 1953. The government's responses were measured, careful, and consistently redirected attention toward the influenza explanation. Harold Macmillan, then Minister of Housing and Local Government and directly responsible for air quality policy, was privately resistant to any action that would implicate coal. The declassified record shows his ministry was aware of the political exposure and worked to manage it rather than address the underlying cause. The calculation was not hidden. It was just never said aloud in public. The final death toll has never been settled with complete certainty, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. The contemporaneous official estimate, produced at the time, put the figure at around 4,000. Decades later, epidemiologists Michelle Bell and Devra Davis went back through the mortality data and published a reassessment in 2001, concluding that the true number of excess deaths in the weeks following the smog was closer to 12,000, 3 times the official figure. Other researchers have placed the total higher still. The government's own internal documents acknowledged excess deaths well above what flu alone could explain, while the public figure remained anchored to the lower count. The range of disagreement is not about whether thousands died. It is about how many thousands the ministry chose not to count. The calculation the ministry was making was not secret exactly. It was implicit. Acknowledging coal as the cause of thousands of deaths would have created an immediate obligation to act. And acting on coal meant confronting the nationalized power industry, the domestic fuel supply, the entire post-war economic settlement. The Beaver Committee, convened in 1953 under Sir Hugh Beaver to investigate air pollution, was itself a delaying mechanism, a way of being seen to act without acting. Its final report, delivered in 1954, recommended controls that the government then took another 2 years to legislate. The Clean Air Act passed in 1956. 4 years after the smog, 4 winters. The Clean Air Act of 1956 did eventually work. That is the complicated part of this story. It designated smoke control areas, restricted the burning of bituminous coal in domestic hearths, and set requirements for chimney heights on new industrial furnaces to improve emissions dispersal. London's air quality improved measurably over the following decade. The infamous P-super fogs faded from the city's life. By the 1970s, the kind of event that killed thousands in 5 days had become essentially impossible in Britain. The legislation, when it finally came, was real and effective. The question the archive leaves open is a simpler one. What was the cost of 4 years of deliberate delay, measured in winters, measured in lungs? The declassified Ministry of Health documents are available today in the National Archives at Kew. They are not dramatic. That is what makes them difficult to read. They are routine memos typed on plain paper passed between men with ordinary titles: Deputy Secretary, Chief Medical Officer, Principal. The language is careful, administrative, almost bored. But the gap between what those documents record internally and what the ministry said publicly is not ambiguous. It is not a matter of interpretation. Senior officials knew the cause, assessed the scale, and chose a different story. Not because they were monsters. Because they were administrators, protecting a system, and the system was more important than the count. Thousands of people dead, the exact number still disputed, which is itself a consequence of how the government counted. A cause that was documented, internally confirmed, and publicly denied for months. A law that passed 4 years later, after 4 more winters. The Great Smog of London is remembered as a natural disaster, an accident of weather and industry. The files suggest something more deliberate, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, something quieter and harder to name. The institutional decision that the cost of honesty was too high, made by people who would never personally pay it. If you want the next file when it opens, subscribe. The archive is always open.